This ring.
A single sentence, a seemingly insignificant key, can unlock a door you never knew existed. For Emma Carter, a 24-year-old waitress struggling under the crushing weight of her mother's mounting medical bills, that sentence was a simple observation, a fleeting remark born of exhaustion and worry. For Nathaniel Drake, a man cocooned in a world of unimaginable wealth, insulated from the harsh realities of everyday life by billions of dollars, that same sentence cracked the very foundation of his carefully constructed existence. She was merely trying to navigate another shift, another day closer to an uncertain future, her mind a whirlwind of financial anxieties and the slow, agonizing decline of her beloved mother. He was just another anonymous tycoon, a figure shrouded in the tailored perfection of his expensive suit, another face in the vast, impersonal tapestry of the business world. Yet, the casual glimpse of a ring, a seemingly innocuous detail, ignited an inferno of revelation, a conflagration that threatened to consume a century-old dynasty, a dynasty built on secrets and carefully curated lies. This isn't a fairy tale. It's the stark, unvarnished truth of how an offhand comment in a humble diner unravels a complex web of deception, betrayal, and a closely guarded secret that one of America's most influential families believed to be buried forever beneath layers of carefully constructed history. The fluorescent lights of the corner booth diner hummed a monotonous, almost hypnotic drone, a soundtrack Eliza knew better than her own pulse. It was the relentless rhythm of her existence, punctuated by the sizzling of burgers on the griddle, the clatter of inexpensive ceramic plates, and the low, indistinct murmur of conversations that seemed perpetually stuck in a loop, never evolving, never changing. On a Tuesday night at 9:00 p.m., the diner enjoyed a momentary lull, a brief respite between the evening rush and the later night crowd. Eliza leaned against the cool, smooth stainless steel of the counter, attempting to ease the tension in her aching shoulders, a tension born of profound physical and emotional exhaustion. The weariness she felt wasn't merely the fatigue of long hours on her feet. It was a deep, soul-wrenching exhaustion, stemming from watching her mother, Laura, slowly wither away in the sterile, beige confines of a hospital room. The bell above the door jingled, its melodic chime a jarring interruption to her weary reverie. A man entered, and an unspoken hush seemed to descend upon the diner, an involuntary acknowledgement of his presence. He wasn't simply well-dressed. He possessed an aura of refined elegance that set him apart, as if he were sculpted from a different, more refined material than the rest of humanity. His charcoal gray suit, so dark it bordered on black, was tailored with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel, clinging to his body with impeccable fit. Even under the diner's dim, grimy lighting, his shoes gleamed, reflecting the faint light with a polished sheen. He exuded an air of quiet, unassuming confidence that demanded no announcement. It simply was. The few remaining patrons instinctively lowered their voices, a subtle demonstration of respectful deference. He selected a booth in the corner, sliding onto the worn vinyl seat with a fluid grace, a studied economy of movement. Eliza approached, her professional smile carefully plastered in place, clutching a menu and a glass of water. "Welcome to the corner booth," she began, her voice trained to a practiced cheerfulness. "Can I get you started with something?" The man didn't bother with the menu. His eyes, a startlingly clear, intense blue, met hers for a fleeting moment, a brief, almost dismissive glance. "Just coffee black," he stated, his voice a low, resonant baritone, a cello in a room filled with the high-pitched, tinny sounds of casual conversation. "Coming right up," Eliza replied, retreating to the counter. Jasmine, her friend and fellow waitress, sidled up beside her, her voice a low whisper. "Get a load of Mr. Moneybags," she said, her tone laced with a mixture of awe and cynicism. "Thinks he's too good for a menu. $10 says he's Nathaniel Drake." Eliza frowned as she poured the coffee. "Who?" "Nathaniel Drake. Pierce Holdings International. They own half the downtown skyline. My dad used to be a foreman on one of their construction sites before he got laid off. That guy's picture is in the business section every other week. They say he's ruthless. Turned his family's millions into billions before he was 30. Eliza glanced at the man. He was staring out the window, his profile sharp and severe against the neon glow of the streetlights. He looked less like a businessman and more like a predator, pausing between hunts, his predatory gaze fixed on something unseen beyond the glass. She picked up the cup and saucer, her professional facade momentarily faltering. "Well," she muttered to herself, "to me, he's just another customer who wants black coffee." She returned to the booth and placed the coffee before him. "Here you are, sir." As he reached for the cup, his hand emerged from his cufflink-adorned sleeve, revealing a ring on his right ring finger that stole Eliza's breath. It wasn't the size or the gleam of the ring that captivated her attention. It was the exquisite design. It was an intricately crafted signet ring, fashioned from a pale, buttery gold. Etched into the flat face was a sigil, a stylized phoenix with wings outstretched, its eye a single, impossibly blue sapphire that glittered like a captured star. The band itself was uniquely carved to resemble intertwined feathers. Eliza's mind reeled, a cascade of memories flooding her consciousness. She saw the ring not gleaming under the diner's harsh fluorescent lights, but resting in a small, velvet-lined bay on her mother's bedside table. Laura's ring was an exact replica, identical in every detail, down to the tiny, impossibly blue sapphire eye. It was her most cherished possession, the one thing she had steadfastly refused to sell, even as medical bills threatened to engulf them in a tidal wave of debt. Her father, she'd always said, had given it to her on his deathbed. "It's a promise, Eliza," she would whisper, her voice frail but unwavering. "A promise of what's right." The words tumbled from Eliza's lips before she could restrain them, a hushed, almost incredulous whisper. "Hi, sir." "My mother has a ring just like yours." Nathaniel Drake froze, his hand hovering over the coffee cup. He slowly retracted it, and his piercing blue eyes locked onto hers. The casual dismissiveness vanished, replaced by an icy intensity that sent a shiver down her spine. He didn't speak. He simply stared, his gaze so sharp and analytical that it felt as though he were dissecting her, searching for the punchline to a joke she hadn't even told. "Excuse me," he finally said, his voice dropping an octave, becoming dangerously soft. Eliza's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the sudden silence. She felt Jasmine's worried stare from across the room. She should have simply walked away, kept her mouth shut, avoided the potential consequences of her impulsive remark. But the image of her mother's frail hand clutching that identical ring was indelibly burned into her mind, a vivid and haunting memory. "The ring?" she stammered, pointing a trembling finger at his hand. It's the same as my mother's. The phoenix, the little sapphire, everything." A flicker of something unreadable crossed his face. Not surprise, not recognition, but something harder, darker, something that chilled her to the bone. He slowly turned his hand over, examining the ring, as if seeing it for the first time. "That's impossible," he stated, his voice devoid of emotion. It wasn't a guess. It was a verdict. "But it's not," Eliza insisted, her voice gaining a desperate edge. "She's had it my whole life. Her father gave it to her. It's one of a kind," he told her. Nathaniel Drake placed his hand flat on the table, the ring a silent, golden accusation. His gaze was as cold and unforgiving as steel. "This ring," he said, enunciating each word with chilling precision, "has been in the Pierce family for over 100 years. It was custom made for my great-grandfather, Alaric Pierce. There is no other. There has never been another. You are mistaken." The finality of his statement felt like a physical blow. He was calling her a liar, or worse, a fool. The injustice of it, piled upon her existing exhaustion and fear for her mother, ignited a spark of defiance within her. "I'm not mistaken," she said, her voice low but firm. "I've held it in my hands 1,000 times. I know every detail on it. I could draw it from memory." He leaned back, a faint, condescending smile playing on his lips. It didn't reach his eyes. "A fascinating story. What is your name?" "Eliza Emma Carter." "Well, Miss Holay," he said, picking up his coffee cup and taking a slow, deliberate sip, "your mother is either a liar or a thief. Because the only way she has a ring like this is if it's the one that was stolen from my family 50 years ago." He set the cup down with a soft click. The sound echoed in the sudden, oppressive silence that descended upon Eliza's world. Stolen. The word hung in the air, thick and poisonous. Her mother, the gentlest, most honest person she knew, a thief? The accusation was so absurd, so vile, it was like being told the sun rose in the west. Nathaniel Drake reached into his suit jacket, produced a slim leather wallet, and extracted 3 $100 bills, placing them on the table. It was more than she earned in 2 shifts. It was an insult, a dismissal. "For the coffee and your time," he said, his eyes already looking past her toward the door. He stood, the sheer force of his presence filling the small booth. He was already gone, moving on, leaving her in the wreckage of his words. As he walked toward the exit, Eliza found her voice, a voice born of desperation and fierce protectiveness. "She's not a thief." He paused at the door, his back to her. He didn't turn around, but his voice carried clearly across the quiet diner. "Then prove it." The bell chimed again, and he was gone, leaving Eliza standing alone in the corner booth, her heart pounding, the hum of the fluorescent lights now sounding like a scream. The 3 crisp bills on the table felt like blood money. She hadn't just served coffee to a billionaire. She had stumbled into a story, his story. And in doing so, she realized, with a cold dread, she may have just destroyed her own. The drive to the hospital was a blur of traffic lights and the anxious, relentless thumping of her own heart. Nathaniel Drake's words echoed in her head. A liar or a thief? It was preposterous. Margaret Carter was a woman who would walk back into a store to return a few cents of extra change. The accusation was a poisoned dart, and Eliza felt its venom spreading through her veins. She found her mother sleeping, her face pale and drawn against the pristine white of the hospital pillow. The ever-present beep of the cardiac monitor provided a fragile, rhythmic reassurance. On the small bedside table, next to a glass of water and a well-worn book of poetry, sat the small dark blue velvet box. With trembling hands, Eliza picked it up. The velvet was worn smooth in places, testament to years of gentle handling. She opened the lid. There it was. The pale gold ring catching the dim light from the hallway, the phoenix with its proud, outstretched wings, and the eye, a tiny sapphire that seemed to hold a universe of secrets. It was identical. There was no question. "Eliza, honey, is that you?" Laura's voice was weak, raspy with exhaustion. Eliza quickly closed the box and turned, forcing a smile. "Hey, Mom, I didn't mean to wake you. Your late rough shift?" Laura's eyes, though clouded with illness, were still sharp, still full of a fierce love that had been Eliza's anchor her entire life. The usual. Eliza couldn't bring herself to tell the truth. How could she voice such a monstrous accusation to this frail woman? "How are you feeling?" "Like I've been run over by a very slow, very expensive truck," Laura said with a weak smile. "The doctors were in. More talk of options? It all sounds the same." She shifted in the bed, wincing, and her eyes fell on the box in Eliza's hand. Her expression changed. The weariness was replaced by a familiar, guarded look. "You were looking at the ring." Eliza hesitated. "I was just thinking about it, about Dad." "Your grandfather?" Laura corrected gently, as she always did. "It was my father who gave it to me, not yours." Eliza's father had been a good man, a mechanic who died in a workshop accident when she was 10, leaving behind nothing but debts and happy memories. The ring predated him. "Right, Granddad," Eliza said, her mind racing. "Mom, tell me about him again." "About the ring?" Laura's gaze drifted to the window, to the dark sky outside. "There's not much to tell that you haven't heard. My father, Elliot, was a quiet man, a brilliant man, an engineer. He worked for a big corporation back east. He said the ring was payment for a promise that was broken by powerful men." "What kind of promise?" Eliza pressed, trying to keep her voice casual. "He never said," Laura replied. "Only that it was about recognizing what was right. He made me swear to never sell it, to keep it safe. He said, one day it might be the only proof we have." "Proof of what?" A flicker of fear, raw and genuine, crossed Laura's face. She looked at Eliza, her eyes pleading. "Leave it be, Eliza. It's an old story, a sad story. It has nothing to do with us anymore. Some doors are best left closed." "But, Mom, what if someone else has a reason to open that door?" The words were out before she could stop them. Laura's grip on her hand tightened. "What do you mean? What happened?" Eliza saw the spike on the heart monitor and cursed herself silently. "Nothing. It's nothing. Just a stupid thing at work." She couldn't burden her mother with this, not now. She needed to protect her. But the seed of doubt had been planted. A promise broken by powerful men. Who were they? And what did any of it have to do with Nathaniel Drake? Miles away, in a penthouse apartment that seemed to float above the city, Nathaniel Drake stood before a floor-to-ceiling window. The city lights spread out below him like a carpet of scattered diamonds. He held a glass of scotch. The amber liquid remained untouched. He hadn't been able to shake the encounter at the diner. The girl, Emma Carter, her wide, honest eyes, her absolute certainty. "My mother has a ring just like yours." It was ludicrous. And yet, he walked over to a heavy mahogany desk and switched on a green-shaded lamp. From a locked drawer, he retrieved a leather-bound folio, the Pierce family archives. It was a curated, sanitized history, of course, but it was all he had. He opened it to the section on family heirlooms. There, on a yellowed page, was a photograph of the ring. His ring. The description was clear. The Phoenix Signet. Commissioned in 1922 by Alaric Pierce. forged by artisan Michel Dubois of Paris. Unique design, symbol of the Pierce family's rebirth from the ashes of the 1921 financial panic. Sole ownership passed down to the male heir of each generation. His father had given him the ring on his 21st birthday. It represents our resilience. Gideon remembered his father saying, his voice thick with pride, "We always rise, never forget that." Gideon's phone buzzed on the desk. He glanced at the screen. "Vivian Hale." He answered. "Adler, you're still up?" came a crisp, no-nonsense voice. Vivian Hale was more than his lawyer. She was his fixer, the executor of his will, and the keeper of his secrets. "Something has come up," Gideon said, his voice tight. "I need you to run a background check, discreetly." "Another hostile takeover?" "A person. Her name is Emma Carter. She works at a diner on 6th Street called the Corner Booth. Her mother's name is Margaret Carter. I want to know everything. Financials, family, history, where they came from, who their people were, everything." There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. Genevieve was too professional to ask why, but he could feel her curiosity. "Is this a personal or professional matter, Gideon?" Gideon looked at the ring on his finger, the phoenix staring back at him with its cold sapphire eye. "I'm not sure yet," he admitted, a rare moment of uncertainty, "but it has the potential to become problematic." He thought back to the story his grandfather used to tell. A story told only in hushed tones after a few too many brandies, about Alaric Pierce's younger brother, Daniel. How Daniel had betrayed the family, tried to steal Alaric's designs for a new kind of turbine engine, and in his greed, had taken the spare signet ring Alaric had foolishly commissioned. Daniel, the story went, was disowned, cast out, and the ring was lost with him, a symbol of treachery. But the official family history, the one in the folio, never mentioned a second ring. It never mentioned a brother named Daniel. It was a ghost story, a family legend, until now. "Find out who Margaret Carter's father was," Gideon commanded, his voice hardening again, the moment of uncertainty passing. "I want his name. I want to know what he did for a living. And I want to know if he ever, for any reason, crossed paths with my family." He hung up the phone. The waitress had said her grandfather gave her mother the ring. A quiet engineer, broken promises, powerful men. For the first time in a very long time, Nathaniel Drake felt a sliver of something other than control. It felt like walking on thin ice, hearing the first faint crackle of it, giving way beneath his feet. He had told the girl to prove it, but now he realized with a grim certainty he had to do the same. He had to prove his own story was the truth. 3 days later, the name arrived in a single encrypted line of text from Vivian Hale. Elliot Morgan. The name meant nothing to Gideon. He ran it through the private databases of Pierce Holdings, cross-referencing it with employee records, contractor lists, and financial dealings going back a century. Nothing. No Elliot Morgan had ever worked for or with his family's company. He felt a wave of relief quickly followed by suspicion. It was too clean. He was stewing in his office, a vast expanse of glass and steel on the 80th floor, when Genevieve herself appeared at his door. She was a severe woman in her 50s, always dressed in impeccably tailored suits, her gray hair pulled back in a tight, shiny bun. She held a thin file. "You're not going to like this," she said, foregoing any greeting. She placed the file on his desk. Gideon opened it. Inside were public records, a birth certificate for Laura Ann Calloway, born in Wilmington, Delaware. Father, Elliot Morgan. Mother, Helen Calloway. And then another document, a patent application from 1968. Inventor, Elliot Morgan. Invention, a novel gearing system for high-torque industrial turbines, a snarl of patent numbers. Application withdrawn. Gideon's blood ran cold. He recognized the schematic. It was a primitive but unmistakable precursor to the Pierce Mark III turbine, the very invention that had catapulted his grandfather's company from a regional player into a global powerhouse in the early 1970s. The invention credited solely to his grandfather, Richard Drake. The application was withdrawn on October 12, 1968, Genevieve said, her voice flat. According to banking records I accessed, on October 14, 1968, Elliot Morgan made a one-time cash deposit of $50,000 into his savings account, a significant sum for an engineer at the time. He quit his job a week later, moved his family, and never worked in engineering again. He died of a heart attack 6 years later at the age of 42. The pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. A non-disclosure agreement, a cash payoff. A brilliant idea bought and buried under the Pierce name. So he was bought off, Gideon said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. My grandfather stole his invention and paid him to keep quiet. It appears that way, Genevieve confirmed. The $50,000 was likely positioned as a consulting fee to keep it legal. There's no paper trail linking it directly to the patent. Of course, your grandfather was meticulous. And the ring? Gideon asked, looking at his own hand. That, Genevieve said, is where it gets strange. I found the jeweler who bought the assets of Dubois, Ace of Paris. The records are ancient, but their ledgers were, like your grandfather, meticulous. In 1922, Alaric Pierce commissioned 2 identical Phoenix signet rings. He paid for both. There's a note in the margin, in the artisan's hand. She slid a translated copy across the desk. It read, "One for the builder, one for the dreamer. May they fly together." 2 rings. The family ghost story wasn't a story. It was true. His great-uncle Daniel existed. So Calloway didn't steal the ring, Gideon murmured, thinking aloud. Daniel Elliott. The disowned brother must have given it to him. But why? As a thank you, a token for a friend, or something more? The puzzle was no longer about a simple diner waitress. It was about the very bedrock of his family's legacy. It was built not just on resilience, but on a lie. The knowledge was a corrosive acid in his gut. He had to speak to her again. Eliza was wiping down the counter at the end of another grueling shift when the bell on the door chimed. Her heart sank. It was him. Nathaniel Drake didn't enter the diner this time. He stood in the doorway, the city lights framing him like a dark halo. He was dressed more casually, in dark trousers and a cashmere sweater, but he still radiated an unapproachable aura of power. Miss Holey, he said, his voice quiet but carrying. I need to speak with you. Jasmine shot her a nervous look. Eliza, you don't have to. But Eliza knew she did. She untied her apron and hung it on its hook. It's okay. I'll be right back. She stepped out into the cool night air. The street was loud with the sounds of the city, a stark contrast to the tense silence that fell between them. Your mother's father? Gideon began, getting straight to the point. His name was Elliot Morgan. It wasn't a question. Eliza flinched. How did he know that? Yes, what of it? He was an engineer. In 1968, he filed a patent for a turbine gear system. Gideon watched her face, carefully gauging her reaction. Eliza's mind went blank. She knew her grandfather was an engineer, but the details were a fog. Her mother never spoke of his work, only of his sadness. I don't know anything about that, she said honestly. I think you do, Gideon countered, his voice sharp with impatience. Or your mother does. My grandfather, Richard Drake, launched a turbine based on an identical design a few years later. It made my family a fortune. Calloway withdrew his patent and accepted a cash payment. This isn't about a stolen ring anymore, is it, Miss Hole? This is about a shakedown. Is that your plan? Use this old story to leverage a payday for your mother's medical bills? The accusation was so cynical, so cruel, it knocked the air from her lungs. Tears of pure rage and frustration sprang to her eyes. "How dare you?" she whispered, her voice shaking. "You stand there in your $1,000 sweater looking down on us. My mother is fighting for her life. You think this is about money. This is about her honor. The honor of a man you just admitted your family probably robbed." For the first time, Gideon looked taken aback. He saw not a schemer, but a daughter pushed to her breaking point. "My grandfather told my mother that ring was proof," Eliza continued, her voice rising. "Proof that he was wronged. He didn't take a payoff. He was threatened, forced to sign away his life's work to protect his family from men like your grandfather. That money wasn't a payment. It was hush money to ensure he never spoke of it again." She was channeling her mother's long-held, unspoken pain. The words felt true, solid, righteous. Gideon was silent for a long moment, the sounds of the city rushing in to fill the space between them. His own certainty was eroding, replaced by the disquieting possibility that the waitress's version of the story, a tale of threats and coercion, was closer to the truth than the sanitized version of a simple business transaction he had constructed. "There were 2 rings," he said, his voice losing its hard edge. "My great-grandfather had 2 made, one for him and one ring was for his brother Daniel. Family lore painted Daniel as a traitor, cast out and ostracized." He looked at her, his blue eyes intensely scrutinizing her face. "Was your grandfather friends with a man named Daniel Elliott?" Eliza stared, utterly bewildered. "Daniel Elliott? I've never heard that name in my life." "We're at an impasse," he stated, the tension palpable. 2 families, 2 rings, and 2 completely different versions of history that converge at a single, fiercely contested point in the past. One story describes a clean, albeit ruthless, business transaction. The other recounts theft and intimidation. And at the heart of it all lies the ghost of Daniel Elliott and a ring that was meant to be a promise. "My mother has the ring," Eliza declared, her resolve hardening. "You have your story. I have mine, and I intend to discover which one is true." Gideon gave a sharp nod, the condescending air replaced by a grudging respect. "So am I." He turned and disappeared into the city's shadows, leaving Eliza with the chilling realization that their quests for truth were now inextricably and dangerously intertwined. The confrontation with Nathaniel Drake left Eliza shaken but resolute. She had defended her family's honor, but his questions resonated deeply within her. Daniel Elliott. The name remained a complete enigma. She returned to the hospital the next day, driven by a renewed sense of urgency. Laura was sitting up, appearing slightly stronger than the previous day. A poetry book lay open on her lap. "Mom," Eliza began, pulling up a chair. "We need to have a serious conversation. No more secrets." Laura sighed wearily and closed the book. "I knew this day would come. Seeing you with the box, I knew you wouldn't let it go." She looked at her daughter, her eyes filled with a profound, ancient sorrow. "What did he say to you?" "Hey?" Eliza asked, feigning ignorance. "Don't play coy, Eliza. The man from the diner. You think a man like Nathaniel Drake makes a scene without someone noticing? Chloe called me. She was frantic with worry." Eliza's shoulders slumped. "He found me. He knows about Granddad Elliott. He thinks we're trying to blackmail him. He thinks Granddad sold his invention to the Pierce family. Laura's expression hardened. Sold it? Is that what they call it? She scoffed, a bitter, rattling sound escaping her lips. Your grandfather was a genius, Eliza. A gentle, trusting soul who believed the world operated on merit and good faith. He worked at a large firm, a competitor to Pierce Industries at the time. He developed his turbine gearing system in his own time. It was his masterpiece. She paused, her gaze distant, lost in the painful memories. He made the mistake of mentioning it to a colleague, trusting him implicitly. That colleague left the company 2 months later for a senior position at Pierce Industries. 6 months after that, your grandfather received a visit from 2 men. They weren't lawyers. They were enforcers. They worked for Richard Drake. The sterile hospital room suddenly felt chillingly cold. What did they do? Eliza whispered, her voice barely audible. They didn't lay a hand on him, Laura said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. They were far more cunning than that. They spread photographs across our kitchen table. Pictures of me playing in the schoolyard. Pictures of your grandmother leaving the grocery store. They told him what a beautiful family he had. And they told him it would be a shame if something were to happen to them. Then they placed a stack of papers in front of him. A non-disclosure agreement, a contract assigning all rights to his invention to a shell corporation owned by Pierce Industries, and an envelope overflowing with cash. The story was far more horrific than Eliza could have ever imagined. This wasn't a business deal. It was pure gangster tactics. He signed everything, Laura continued, her voice trembling with unshed tears. What choice did he have? He took the money because refusing it would have been an act of defiance, and he was too terrified to defy them. We moved a week later. He was a broken man, Eliza. They didn't just steal his work. They stole his soul. He died 6 years later. But the truth is, they killed him that day in our kitchen. Tears streamed down Eliza's face. She finally understood the deep well of sadness in her mother, the constant fear behind her warnings. But the ring, Mom, Eliza pressed gently. Where does the ring fit into all of this? Who is Daniel Elliott? Laura flinched at the name, a genuine, startled reaction. Where did you hear that name? Gideon told me. He said his great-grandfather had 2 rings made, one for himself and one for his brother Daniel, who was disowned. Laura remained silent for a full minute, her brow furrowed in deep concentration. Daniel Elliott never mentioned the name Pierce. He only ever referred to him as my friend, his only friend during that horrific time. She began to recount a different aspect of the story, one she'd never shared before. After Elliott was forced out of his job, he plunged into a deep depression. But one man sought him out, a man who identified himself only as Daniel. He was a drifter, an outcast, but he possessed an artist's soul and a profound hatred for the kind of corporate greed that had destroyed Elliott. He had heard what happened to Elliott through the engineering grapevine. This Daniel, Laura recounted, told your grandfather that he, too, had been betrayed by a powerful family. He understood what it meant to have everything stolen by one's own blood. They became friends, 2 broken men finding solace in each other's company. Before Daniel left town for good, he gave Elliott the ring. She looked at Eliza, her eyes filled with intensity. He told Elliott this was meant to symbolize a shared dream between brothers. It was forged in hope and tainted by greed. It belongs to the wronged, not the wrongdoer. Keep it as proof that integrity has a value that money can't buy. One day, the phoenix will rise for the right person. Elliott cherished that ring more than the invention itself. It was a symbol that he wasn't alone in his suffering. So Daniel Elliott wasn't a traitor. He was another victim, and he had given the ring, his birthright, to another wronged man as an act of solidarity. The story was far more profound, far more tragic than Gideon's cold, detached family history. Meanwhile, Gideon was at his family's ancestral home, a sprawling stone estate an hour outside the city. He rarely visited. It felt more like a museum than a home filled with portraits of stern-faced ancestors. In the library, a room paneled in dark wood that smelled of old paper and polish, he encountered his cousin, Dominic Vance. Robert was a few years older, with a practiced smile and the effortless charm of a man who had never had to work a day in his life. He managed the family's charitable foundation, a role that involved attending galas and cutting ribbons. "Gideon, to what do we owe the honor?" Robert asked, pouring 2 glasses of brandy. "Tired of the concrete jungle?" "I'm looking for information," Gideon said, cutting straight to the point. "About Great-Uncle Daniel." Robert's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. "Daniel? The black sheep? That old ghost story? What's gotten into you?" "I have reason to believe the story is true, and I need to know the details. The real details, not the sanitized version." Robert swirled the brandy in his snifter, suddenly looking thoughtful. "Well, you know the legend. He was the younger brother, the artist, the dreamer. Alaric, on the other hand, was the pragmatist, the builder. Daniel apparently accused Alaric of stealing his ideas for the company's early successes. He tried to orchestrate a boardroom coup. When it failed, he vanished. But not before stealing a valuable ring and allegedly selling company secrets to a rival. Robert sighed dramatically. A classic tale of sibling rivalry and betrayal. It's why the line of succession has always been so rigidly defined, to prevent another Daniel. This was the story Gideon had always known. But hearing it now, it felt thin, theatrical. A convenient narrative to justify Alaric's consolidation of power. "And you believe that?" Gideon asked skeptically. "Why shouldn't I? It's our history," Robert said with a shrug. "It's a bit dramatic, sure, but it explains why the family closed ranks. Why Grandpa William was so aggressive in his business dealings. He was protecting the family legacy from vultures, from another betrayal." He leaned forward, his voice conspiratorial. Why the sudden interest? Did one of his descendants crawl out of the woodwork looking for a handout? The question was casual, but the look in Robert's eyes was sharp, probing. Gideon felt an instinctive distrust. Robert had always seemed vapid, but perhaps that was a carefully constructed facade. "It's a private matter," Gideon said, his voice clipped. Of course," Robert said, leaning back, the charming smile returning. "Well, if you want to dig up old bones, be my guest. The old family papers are in the West Wing study. Grandpa William's private correspondence. Knock yourself out. Just don't be surprised if the ghost you find is uglier than you imagined." Gideon left Robert with his brandy and went to the study. The room was dusty, unused for years. He found boxes of letters tied with faded ribbon. For hours, he sorted through them, reading his grandfather's elegant cursive script. Most of it was business. But then he found a series of letters from the late 1960s addressed to his grandfather's head of security. The content made him feel physically ill. There were updates on the surveillance of a man named Elliot Morgan, reports on his daughter's school schedule, his wife's daily routine, and then a final, chilling memo. Subject: Calloway. Neutralized. Assets secured. He is no longer a threat. Neutralized. Assets secured. Eliza Holloway's story was true. It was all true. His family's fortune was built on theft and cemented with threats. The weight of the discovery was crushing. But as he continued to sift through the papers, he found something else. Something that didn't fit either his story or Eliza's. It was a single folded note, separate from the letters, tucked into the back of a ledger. It was in his grandfather William's handwriting, but it was frantic, almost illegible. He knows. R.H. found him. Daniel is the key. Must protect the name. The note was undated. Who was he? And who was R.H.? It seemed too convenient. And what did it mean? Daniel is the key. Daniel was supposed to be a ghost, a long-vanished traitor. But this note, written decades after Daniel's disappearance, spoke of him as a present, active threat. Gideon stood in the dusty, silent study, holding two conflicting accounts. In one hand, the sordid truth of his grandfather's crime against Elliot Morgan. In the other, a cryptic note that suggested a deeper, more complex conspiracy was at play. The story was no longer just about his grandfather and Eliza's. There was a third player, a hidden thread. And the name of that thread was Daniel. The discovery of his grandfather's note threw Gideon into a state of focused obsession. He knows. R.H. found him. Daniel is the key. It was a cipher, and Gideon knew he couldn't crack it alone. The animosity between him and Eliza had vanished, replaced by the grim reality that they were the only two people with a vested interest in uncovering the complete truth. He found her where he knew she'd be, in the hospital cafeteria, staring into a cup of coffee with the same haunted expression he saw in his own mirror. He sat down opposite her, placing a thin file on the table between them. "Your mother was right," he said, his voice devoid of its usual authority, filled instead with a quiet gravity. "My grandfather put your family through hell." He pushed the file forward. It contained copies of the surveillance reports on the Calloway family. "This is the proof." Eliza opened the file, her hands trembling as she read the cold, clinical descriptions of her mother as a little girl, being watched. Her face paled. She looked up at him, her eyes wide with a mixture of vindication and horror. "Why are you showing me this?" "Because my story is falling apart and so is yours," Gideon said. "There's more to it." He told her about the note. Daniel is the key. It was written by his grandfather William, long after her grandfather was silenced. He was scared of someone who knew the truth about Daniel. "But Daniel gave my grandfather the ring," Eliza frowned. "He was an outcast, a victim like Elliot. That's what he told your grandfather." "But what if that wasn't the whole story?" Gideon countered. "What if Daniel's disappearance wasn't just about him being cast out? We have two stories, yours and mine, but they're both based on what we were told by people who were themselves betrayed or lying. We need a primary source, an objective truth. Where do we find that?" "The rings," Gideon said, a spark of inspiration in his eyes. "They're the one constant. They're the origin point. My great-grandfather, Alaric, commissioned them from a Parisian artisan, Michel Dubois. The business is gone, but I found the firm that acquired its assets and, more importantly, its records, the ledgers, in Paris." Eliza's heart sank. That was a world away. "I had the relevant pages scanned and sent over this morning," Gideon said, tapping his phone. "The high-resolution images are waiting in my office. I need another set of eyes. Your eyes. You know your ring better than anyone." An hour later, Eliza found herself in a place she could never have imagined. Nathaniel Drake's office on the 80th floor. The silence was absolute. The view of the city was breathtaking. On a massive screen that covered one wall was a high-resolution image of a page from an old leather-bound ledger. The script was elegant, spidery French. A translated transcript scrolled beside it. They pored over the entry for Alaric Pierce's 1922 commission. As Genevieve had discovered, it listed 2 identical rings. But as they zoomed in on the artisan's original French notes, Eliza saw something the translator had missed. The translator's note read, "One for the builder, one for the dreamer." But the original French was more specific. Eliza had taken 4 years of French in high school, and while she was rusty, one phrase jumped out at her. "Guardian," Eliza said slowly, pointing at the screen. "That's not dreamer. Guardian de l'âme. It means guardian of the soul." Gideon zoomed in, reading the phrase. "Guardian of the soul," he repeated, the words feeling heavy and significant. A builder of an empire and a guardian of its soul. It wasn't a rivalry. It was meant to be a partnership, a balance. This changed everything. Alaric and Daniel weren't meant to be competitors. They were meant to be 2 halves of a whole. The story of Daniel's betrayal was a complete fabrication. As they scanned further down the page, Gideon noticed a small annotation next to the entry, added in a different hand and with different ink. It was dated 1945. "What's this?" he murmured, enlarging the note. The French was spidery and difficult to read. "Reçu lettre de Monsieur Daniel Elliott. Il demande une modification à la seconde bague, à l'intérieur de la bande. Il n'est plus un Pierce, il est quelque chose d'autre." Gideon translated haltingly. "He asks for a modification to the second ring on the inside of the band. He's no longer a Pierce. He is something else." Gideon and Eliza exchanged a look. "No longer a Pierce," Eliza whispered. "He changed his name," Gideon realized. When he was cast out, he abandoned the family name entirely. The note continued, "Irel Elliott." "He asked me to inscribe a name," Gideon read, his voice catching on the name Elliott. Eliza gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "Elliott. My grandfather's name. But this was in 1945. My grandfather wouldn't have met Daniel for another 20 years. "It's not your grandfather's name," Gideon said, a sudden, shocking realization dawning on him. He typed furiously on his keyboard, pulling up his family's genealogy records, going back further than he ever had before. His fingers flew, his mind racing. He found his great-grandfather, Alaric Pierce, then his great-grandmother, Beatrice. And then he found her family tree. Her maiden name was Beaumont. And her father, Alaric's father-in-law, his name was Elliott Beaumont, a wealthy shipping magnate who had bankrolled Alaric's early ventures, who had died in 1944. The truth hit them both like a physical blow. The inscription wasn't for Eliza's grandfather. It was a memorial. "The ring," Eliza breathed, piecing it together. The ring wasn't for 2 brothers to share. It was for a father and son. Alaric Pierce and his son William, my grandfather. "No," Gideon said, his eyes wide with the horrifying clarity of the truth. Alaric didn't have a son named William in 1922. His son William was born in 1925. In 1922, Alaric Pierce had 1 child, a son born in 1905, his firstborn son. He clicked one last time, and a black and white photograph filled the screen. It was a formal portrait of 2 young men, both handsome and proud. One was clearly a young Alaric Pierce. The other, the dreamer, the guardian of the soul, was his brother. Underneath the photograph was the caption, "Alaric and Daniel Elliott, 1921. And beneath that, in the official genealogical record, was the final, devastating piece of the puzzle. The entry for Daniel Elliott listed his full name, Daniel Elliott Pierce. Daniel was the Elliott the ring was inscribed for. It wasn't a memorial to his father-in-law. He was reclaiming his middle name, the only part of his identity his brother couldn't take from him. The twist was so profound, so complete, that the room fell silent. The entire family history was a lie. Daniel wasn't the younger brother. Based on his birth year, he was the older brother. He should have been the heir. Alaric was the younger son, the builder. And Richard Drake, Gideon's grandfather, wasn't Alaric's only son. He was the second son. Daniel was Alaric's firstborn. No, wait. Gideon looked at the birth dates again. Daniel, born 1905. William, born 1925. That couldn't be right. They weren't brothers. Alaric and Daniel were brothers. But William wasn't Daniel's brother. He was his nephew. The story they'd been chasing was wrong. The players were wrong. Eliza's grandfather hadn't met a random outcast. He had met Daniel Elliott Pierce, the true disinherited heir to the Pierce fortune. And Daniel hadn't given him a token of solidarity. He had given him the ring, his own ring, inscribed with his own name, for safekeeping. It was a piece of evidence, a dormant claim to an empire. And Richard Drake, Gideon's grandfather, hadn't just stolen an invention from Elliot Morgan. He had done it to suppress a man who had been in contact with the one person on earth who could challenge his own father's, and therefore his own, legitimacy. His uncle, Daniel Elliott. The note. He knows. RHA found him. Daniel is the key, snapped into focus. He was Elliot Morgan. RH was likely Robert's father or grandfather, another part of the conspiracy. And Daniel was the key because his existence and his connection to Calloway threatened to unravel the foundational lie upon which Richard Drake's entire life and fortune were built. They hadn't just silenced an inventor. They were silencing a witness. The truth, pieced together from the artisan's ledger, was more corrupt than they had ever imagined. Daniel Elliott Pierce, the rightful heir, had been systematically erased from history. Gideon's grandfather, William, had silenced Elliot Morgan, not over a simple invention, but to bury the foundational lie of their family's power. It became terrifyingly clear that Gideon's cousin, Robert, knew this dirty secret and was positioning himself to use it as a weapon in a corporate power play. There was only one place to force a reckoning: the annual Pierce Foundation Charity Gala, Robert's personal stage. For Eliza, her mother's presence was non-negotiable. This fight was no longer just about uncovering the truth. It was about delivering justice. And for that to happen, the victim's voice had to be heard. The grand ballroom glittered with false brilliance, a perfect setting for the unmasking. Robert was in his element, the charming, benevolent host. That was until he saw Gideon and Eliza cutting a path directly toward him. His practiced smile became a brittle facade. "Robert," Gideon began, his voice low and cold, cutting through the pleasantries. "The games are over. We know about Daniel Elliott Pierce, the true heir." Robert scoffed, preparing a condescending dismissal. "Gideon, you've clearly been listening to fairy tales from..." He was cut off by a woman's voice, weak but amplified by a microphone that sliced through the ballroom's polite chatter. "His fairy tale cost my father his life." A hush fell over the room. All eyes turned to the entrance where Laura Holloway sat in a wheelchair. Her gaze locked on Robert with an intensity that defied her frailty. "Richard Drake destroyed my father because he was friends with the honorable man your family threw away," Laura declared. "My father was forced to keep your secret. I will not." As gasps rippled through the stunned crowd, the massive screens on stage, meant to display photos of the Foundation's good works, flickered. Eliza held up her phone, and the damning image from the Parisian ledger filled the screens for all to see. The entry detailing the commission for 2 rings, and the name to be inscribed within the second. Elliot. Trapped, Robert stared from Laura's accusing face to the irrefutable proof on the screens. He was cornered by a ghost from the past and evidence set in stone. Gideon stepped forward, his voice ringing with chilling authority. "My family's legacy is built on a lie," he announced to the captive audience. "A lie my grandfather silenced a man to protect, and a lie my cousin," he turned, pinning Robert with a glare, "planned to use for his own personal gain." The public accusation pushed Robert over the edge. His carefully constructed composure shattered into pure, unrestrained rage. "You fool, Gideon," he hissed, forgetting the live microphone just inches from his mouth. "I was trying to protect us. I knew the truth, and I kept it buried. You and your pathetic little waitress have ruined everything." The confession, amplified for all to hear, echoed in the dead silence of the ballroom. In a single, self-incriminating breath, Robert had confirmed a century of corruption and authored his own spectacular downfall. He stood alone, exposed under the glittering chandeliers, the king of a corrupt castle that had just crumbled to dust around him. The aftermath of the gala was a whirlwind of headlines and resignations. The Pierce dynasty was shaken, but in the ensuing quiet, it was being reborn, not broken. Weeks later, in a sun-drenched private hospital suite, a fragile peace had settled. Laura Holloway, looking out over a green garden, had a light in her eyes that Eliza hadn't seen in years. The weight of a lifetime of secrets had finally been lifted. Nathaniel Drake entered the room quietly, no longer an untouchable tycoon, but a man humbled by the truth. He didn't offer empty apologies. Instead, he placed a leather-bound document on the table beside Laura's bed. "The Daniel Elliott Pierce Foundation," he said, his voice steady and sincere. "It will exist to fund the independent inventors and artists my family tried to crush. A substantial portion of my family's considerable wealth will serve as the endowment, with Elliott Morgan's estate designated as the first honorary beneficiary." Eliza's eyes welled with tears. This was more than mere restitution. It was justice, forged into a powerful, enduring legacy. Laura gently reached out, covering Gideon's hand with her own. "You have honored him," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You have honored them all." Gideon then turned to Eliza, carefully removing his phoenix ring. He placed it beside the original ring, the one that had initiated this entire extraordinary journey. The 2 rings, twin flames of pale gold, lay side by side, finally reunited after a long and arduous separation. "One for the builder, one for the guardian," he said, his gaze unwavering as it met hers. "I can rebuild the company," he continued, his voice carrying a weight of profound meaning. "But it has been missing its soul for a century. Help me bring it back, Eliza." It wasn't an offer of financial gain or political influence. It was an offer of purpose, a shared mission, a chance to right a century of wrongs. Looking at the 2 rings, potent symbols of a promise finally fulfilled, Eliza saw a clear path forward, a future brimming with possibility and purpose. "Yes," she said, her voice steady and strong, her heart overflowing with a newfound hope. "Let's give them a legacy to believe in, a legacy built on truth and justice." A single, seemingly insignificant sentence, uttered in the quiet intimacy of a late-night diner, set in motion a chain of events that irrevocably altered the course of history. Emma Carter, a waitress who fearlessly fought for her mother's honor, demonstrated the undeniable power of truth, proving that even the most deeply buried secrets cannot forever remain hidden. Her unwavering courage showed that truth possesses a strength that surpasses even the most formidable fortunes. And Nathaniel Drake, a billionaire ensnared in a gilded cage of lies and deceit, finally discovered that genuine wealth isn't measured in inherited fortunes, but rather in the unwavering integrity one chooses to cultivate and uphold. Their story serves as a powerful reminder that every family harbors its own hidden secrets, and that sometimes it takes the courage and conviction of an outsider to bring those truths to light, allowing the phoenix to finally rise from the ashes of the past, reborn and stronger than before. If this compelling tale of truth, justice, and the extraordinary power of a single voice has resonated with you, please show your support by liking this video and sharing it with others who appreciate stories that delve deeper than mere fiction. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more true-life dramas that will linger in your memory long after the credits roll. Click that notification bell so you won't miss a single upload. Thank you for watching.